Here's the deal. I love Christmas. Anybody in the room with me on that? Raise your hand if you love Christmas. I love the Christmas music, the movies, the decorations. I love Christmas. I feel like I say that every year. I just want you to know I love Christmas. And here's the deal. How many in the room know how many days there are till Christmas? Anybody know? Raise your hand if you know. Some of you are like, no, I'm trying to forget. 27 days until Christmas. Isn't that great? Yeah, it's great depending on your age. Because here's what I can tell you. That news hits your ears different depending on your age. The fact of the matter is, there are many of you in the room, you're adults and you're parents, and that news hits you different than it did a kid. If you're an adult or you're a parent, here's what that told you. All of a sudden, 27 days till Christmas, the race is on, right? All you can think about is how fast those 27 days are going to go, right? And you think about all of the things you have to do from now till then. You think about all the things you don't have done, the presents you haven't bought, the list of things that you want to get done, and you think there's no way the race is on. But if you are a kid, the race isn't on, the wait is on, right? Yeah. Right? You look at those 27 days and you're like, oh no, that's an eternity, right? It's never gonna get here, right? When you're a kid, the wait can feel and seem excruciating when you're waiting for Christmas, right? It can almost seem like time stops. And it's really irritating when you're excited, anticipating it, and the people around you aren't as excited as you are, right? Because for you, you can't wait for Christmas to come. And so the 27 days can feel like an eternity. In fact, they can feel so long that sometimes, you ready? This is confession. Sometimes, some of us, nobody in this room I'm sure, take matters into our own hands. This is confession time. We're going to come clean before Christmas. Ready? I want you to raise your hand if you're sitting here today and if you've ever taken matters into your own hands by looking for your Christmas presents before December 25th. Raise your hand if you're in that boat. Keep them high, nice. Get it out, right? Some of you are lying, I think. I don't know. Here's the deal. Now, I'm not done. Put your hands down. Raise your hand if you didn't just look for your Christmas presents before December 25th, but if you actually found them and opened them before December 25th. Raise them nice and high. I like it, all right? You're getting less. All right? Put your hands down. Raise your hand if you actually found them, opened them, and rewrapped them for December 25th. Raise your hand. I like it, all right. I'm not done. Raise your hand if you opened them, you found them, you opened them, you ready? You played with them, and then rewrap them and put them back under the tree. Raise your hand, all right? There's about 2 of you. I can't believe you did that, man. That's not... All right, ready? All right, here we go. Raise your hand if you took matters into your own hands and you found them, opened them, played with them, broke them, rewrapped them, put them back under the tree. Anybody? Nobody this service. All right, the last 2 services I had some, right? Here's the deal. Waiting can be excruciating. And here's what I know about waiting, all right? If you've ever done that, which some of you didn't, or at least you didn't confess it, right? But here, it can spoil Christmas, right? It can spoil Christmas. It's not as fun as you think when you know what you're going to get on Christmas Day. I never opened one of my presents before Christmas, but I had a sister that was 5 years younger than me. And so what I did was I conned her into telling me what I was going to get for Christmas. I can remember when she was young, somehow she knew what I was going to get. And I said, hey, Stephanie, what am I going to get for Christmas? She said, it's a secret, and I promised I'd keep the secret. I'm not going to tell. I said, can you tell me anything about it? She said, I'm not going to tell you what you got for Christmas. But she said, I will tell you this. It's orange, it's round, and it goes in a basket. Now, I thought to myself, wow, that's awesome. I know what I'm getting for Christmas. And you know what I found? Christmas morning when I opened my basketball, if you didn't put that together, when I opened my basketball, it kind of spoiled it a little bit for me. I'm like, I already knew what I was getting, right? There's something about the wait. But sometimes it can be excruciating as a kid when you're waiting for Christmas. Here's what I know. What can be excruciating as a kid when you're waiting for Christmas can be equally, ready? Equally excruciating as an adult, ready? When you're waiting for God. And he doesn't seem to be speaking up or showing up like you thought. Waiting can be excruciating, and it can begin to compromise the one thing we all long for, and that's our hope. It can begin to erode hope. Waiting sometimes can rob us of hope. It can create doubt. And for some of us, the longer we wait, the more tempted we are just to take matters into our own hands. We are a group of people, we are a country that longs for hope. I know this because we elect officials based upon their message of hope. We've been doing that for years. It goes clear back. Let me take you on a little history lesson. 1984, President Ronald Reagan. Raise your hand if you were not alive when he was president. Just raise your hand. I want to see it. Isn't that amazing? Those of you who, okay, this is Ronald Reagan, for those of you who raised your hand. And he gave us the message of hope, the message of a shining city on a hill. Do you remember that? Shining city. So there's hope. We then elected a president. His name was President Bush, the first President Bush, 1988. And he came with a message of a kinder and gentler America, the hope of a kinder, gentler nation. 1992, we elected a candidate based on his message of hope. We elected a man named Bill Clinton, who still believed in a place called hope. And because our country did, we elected him because we still believed in a place called hope. 2004, we elected another president, the second George Bush, and he came with a message, I want a safer and more hopeful America. And then in 2008, we elected a candidate, and his motto was built, and his presidential campaign was built on hope and change. Our world longs for hope. Our country is thirsty for hope. And us as individuals are desperate and need hope. It made me think of a story that I read recently. This story took place in World War II. And it was about a submarine that was coming into town, and this submarine that was coming into town was making its way into Newport News, Virginia. And as it began to dock, all of a sudden something went wrong and it began to sink. The Coast Guard deployed to see what was going on, and as the divers went down, they got to the hull of the ship. And as they got to the hull of the ship, they found out that there was an inventive sailor that was in the sub who had grabbed a hammer, and he had thought to, in Morse code, tap out a question. And his question was simply this, as he tapped, is there hope? And the writer of the article said that is the fundamental question of life. That thousands of people have asked that same question in thousands of different ways. They ask it in the doctor's office. They ask it in the marital counseling office, the tax accountant's office. They ask it in regards to their children. They ask it in regards to life. Is there hope? And the writer goes on to say that we can live 40 days without food. He says we can live 3 days without water, 8 minutes without air, but not a single second without hope. Hope is essential for our life. And many people, he says today, are so desperate for hope, maybe you're one, that they'll buy anything in order to get them some hope. And then he says this, but there's nothing, listen close, nothing that begins to shake the foundation of our hope quite like waiting while God seems silent, absent, and slow to act. Nothing rattles our hope when the God that we put our hope in seems far away and very quiet. When the moments of silence begin, I begin asking myself, why do I keep praying? Why do I keep worshiping? Why do I keep following? Why do I stay committed? Why am I so devoted when God seems so quiet? And how do I keep going when it seems like God's not speaking up? Some of you, if we're honest, some of you are in that boat right now. God feels very far away. God seems very quiet and silent in your life right now. And I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're here because that's what the story of Christmas is all about. The story of Christmas is all about discovering and holding on to hope even when God seems silent, appears absent, uninvolved, or at minimum is awfully slow to show up from my perspective. So here's what I want to do this Christmas. I want to take this story off the mantle, so to speak. Sometimes when it comes to Christmas, we sanitize the Christmas story, and I want to dig into the realness of it. And here's what I can tell you this morning. The Christmas story, the first Christmas story, is couched not just in a silent night, but it comes at the end of many, many, many silent nights. In fact, the Christmas story comes at the end, listen close, at the end of 400 excruciating years of silent nights. There was a group of people who lived all of their lives waiting for God to keep his promise, waiting for God to deliver Messiah, and God said nothing. It appeared like he stopped acting, ready? And maybe even he stopped caring. If you look at the very last book in the Old Testament, your Bible's split into two parts. There's an Old Testament and there's a New Testament. The very last book in the Old Testament is called the book of Malachi. When you read the last words in the book of Malachi, they are the last words God speaks, divinely inspired words he speaks for over 400 years. That's longer than our country's been in existence. He goes silent. There's no prophets. There's no apparent activity. And his people simply wait to see if he's going to keep his promises given some 2,000 years before. And with each silent night that passes, it only intensifies. There were some who could not, and they would not hold on to hope in the middle of that. And so they abandoned their faith. They deserted, and they took matters into their own hands. But there was a small band of people who kept the faith, kept their hope, even when God appeared silent. Two of them, their names were Zechariah and Elizabeth. Have you ever heard of them? The Christmas story is very much about Zechariah and Elizabeth. And their story is found in Luke chapter 1. It starts in verse 5. If you don't feel comfortable using a Bible, I'll read with you off the screen. Here's what it says. In the time of Herod, king of Judea. Let's stop for a minute. Sometimes we read words like that, and we read them as though they're a preface to the really important part of the verse. And yet this tells us exactly when this happens. This happens at the tail end of those 400 years of excruciating silence. This happens when the Romans are in charge. The Jewish people are in captivity, and the Romans have placed over the Jewish people an insecure, power-hungry king of the Jews. His name was Herod. Same Herod who eventually would kill the baby boys in Bethlehem. In that time, there was a priest. His name was Zechariah. This priest named Zechariah belonged to the priestly division of Abijah. He had a wife, and his wife's name was Elizabeth, and she was also a descendant of Aaron. Here's what that's telling us. We have Zechariah, and he was a preacher's kid, for lack of a better way of putting it, and he became a preacher himself. He himself married a preacher's kid. Elizabeth was from a line of preachers, or priests, as it were. And they are living in this time when there is this national desperation because God seems silent. And look what it says. Don't miss this. Both of them were righteous in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commands and decrees blamelessly. I want you to get this. Both of them in this time, this 400 years when it seemed like God had gone silent, in this 400 years when other people had abandoned the faith, in this 400 years when other people took matters into their own hands, in this 400 years when it seemed like God's not going to show up, maybe God forgot us, not Zechariah and Elizabeth. They kept the faith. They kept praying, kept worshiping, kept following, they kept committed. They were devoted. Which begs the question. Well, Zechariah and Elizabeth, how'd that work out for you? And look at verse 7. But they were childless. It's hard for me to overstate what that would have meant in their culture. It's hard for me to overstate the hopeless feeling a couple would have had not able to reproduce and carry on the family line. Here's two people that in the middle of God's silence and watching people peel away, they keep the faith. They're doing the right things. They're hanging on to hope. And yet having to navigate their own personal disappointment. They were childless because Elizabeth was not able to conceive. And their hope was waning quick. You know why? Because both of them were very old. in the middle of this national despair, when it seemed like God was not only silent, when people were bailing left and right, they themselves were navigating their own personal disappointment, praying and feeling like their prayers were hitting the ceiling and not getting anywhere. Can I ask you a question this morning? Can I ask you a question? You ever felt that way? You ever look around at society and you're like, man, God, when's the next time you're going to drop in? It feels like it's going to hell in a handbasket. Everything's going crazy. The wheels are coming off the bus. And I keep plugging away. I keep the faith. I stay committed. I stay devoted. And yet, while I stay devoted and other people abandon ship, other people give up hope, other people run away, while I stay committed, sometimes it can feel like the things I'm praying for never get heard. Sometimes it feels like you're silent, God. How in the world do you hang on to hope when God is so quiet? I think the story of Zechariah and Elizabeth give us the secret. Here's the secret in a nutshell. I want you to write it down. When God seems silent, I should never confuse God's silence with his absence. I think their story fleshes that out. Sometimes when God seems so quiet and so silent, we can assume maybe he's absent or at minimum he's disinterested. Their story picks up in verse 8. It says, once when Zechariah's division was on duty and he was serving as priest before God, it was his turn, so to speak. He was chosen by lot, that's the way they did it, according to the custom of the priesthood, to go into the temple of the Lord and burn incense. It was a big deal, right? He's going to the Holy Holies. When the time for the burning of incense came, all the assembled worshipers, they're outside, and so he's in there alone. And here's what happens. Then the angel of the Lord appears to Zechariah, standing at the right side of the altar of incense. When Zechariah saw him, look what it says. He was startled and was gripped with fear. That's interesting, isn't it? Here's what's interesting to me about that. Because when he sees the angel, he's gripped with fear. Why? Because when you see an angel, it's kind of scary, right? I've been a pastor for like over 20 years, and I hear some interesting stories, and I hear people who say, you know something, I saw an angel last night. I'm like, really? I always say, tell me what it was like. Tell me what they said. Tell me how that felt, right? And usually when they, we kind of had a conversation, kind of like we walked through the meadow together and stuff. I'm like, man, you didn't see an angel like they're talking about in the Bible. Because everywhere they show up, right? Everywhere they show up, it's kind of like a scary deal, right? It's like somebody from the very presence of God. Zechariah knows something's up. He's not saying, hey, what's up? That's not what he's doing. He's like, I'm gripped with fear. Angel gives the standard angel response, right? Don't be afraid, right? Why? Look at this. You ought to underline this in your Bible. Don't be afraid, Zechariah. Your prayer has been heard. Let me ask you a question. Isn't it true when God seems silent and inactive, it can feel like, you ready? It can feel like he's not listening anymore. Anybody with me? It can feel like when God seems silent that he no longer is interested. He's no longer paying attention to me. I wonder how long they prayed for the nation of Israel. I wonder how long they prayed for a child in their 20s, their 30s, their 40s, their 50s, their 60s. I don't know. And God's quiet. And sometimes when God is quiet, it can feel like our prayers are just bouncing off the ceiling. And here's what happens. Many times we begin to think, if he ain't listening, I ain't talking. Right? If he ain't listening, I ain't talking, because we confuse listening. We confuse God listening with he'll respond the way I want him to in the time I want him to. And yet the story of Christmas tells me this, that even when God seems silent, I can't confuse his silence with his absence. I can be absolutely confident that he's still listening to me. That's what the angel says to Zechariah. I hear you. I hear your prayer. God is listening. Some of you in the room this morning, you're praying and it feels like your prayers are bouncing off the ceiling. Now listen, I'm going to tell you something that's going to sound kind of interesting at first. It's going to sound funny. I think you're in great company. If that's the way you feel this morning, I think you're in great company, and I think you'll absolutely love the Bible. Because the Bible is real, it's raw, and it's gritty. And the Bible is full of people who prayed, who engaged with God, and were met with a deafening silence. The Bible does not try to sanitize that. In fact, you could read of a guy named Job, and Job loses just about everything you can lose other than his life. And for 40 chapters in the book of Job, Job's met with a deafening silence. You could go further and read about Abraham, who's given this incredible promise that he's going to have this great nation, that he's going to have all of these descendants that are come from his line. And he's met with a deafening silence. Or you can go to the book of Genesis and read about a guy named Joseph, who at age 17 is sold into slavery. And for 13 years, feels like God's not showing up. 13 years, nothing happens. Or better yet, you can go read about some of Jesus' friends. Their names were Mary and Martha. And their brother is about ready to die, and they send word to God with skin on, Jesus, come help us. Nothing. You see, the truth is, there are sometimes that God, in his silence, it can confuse us. I like how John Calvin puts it. He says, God grants our prayers even if he doesn't always respond to the exact form of our request. Even when he doesn't comply with what we're praying, he is still very attentive and kindly to our prayers, so that hope relies on his word and never disappoints us. Tim Keller says this, God will either give us what we ask, or when he doesn't, he'll give us what we would have asked if we knew everything he knows. You see, here's the deal. Sometimes, I want to say this and just let it percolate. Just let it percolate this afternoon. Sometimes it's God's silence that drives us deeper into what he wants more than anything. He wants us to drive deeper into his presence. What he doesn't want is a bunch of people just talking at him. He wants people who will run into him. And sometimes it's in the silence when I run deeper in to the very presence and the profound nature of who God is. I dare not confuse his silence with his absence. His silence is not divine deafness. He's listening. Now the story picks up end of verse 13. Look what it says. This is fascinating. So the angel says to Zechariah, your wife Elizabeth, she's going to bear you a son. You're to call him John. He'll be a joy and delight to you, and many will rejoice because of his birth, for he'll be great in the sight of the Lord. He's never to take wine or other fermented drink, and he'll be filled with the Holy Spirit even before he's born. He'll bring back many of the people of Israel to the Lord their God, and he'll go on before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous. Look at this next part. To make ready a people prepared for the Lord. Listen, let me tell you what's going on here. Angel says, hey, Zach, guess what? Y'all are going to have a kid. I'm going to call him John. He's going to be special. In fact, he's going to be so special that I realized that when the book of Malachi, stay with me, when the book of Malachi ended, it felt like the curtain closed. But I'm about ready to open the curtain. And when the curtain opens back up, your kid's going to play a very, very special role in the next scene I got coming. Let me put it this way. How many of you in the room, I have a question for you. How many in the room have ever been to a Broadway play? Raise your hand. I want to see if anybody in the room. Okay, a couple of you, right? I'm not the most cultured guy in the world. I guess you can probably figure that out, right? Grew up in the mountains of Pennsylvania, but my wife has taken me to a few plays, never a Broadway play, okay? And if you've ever been to a play, here's what you find out. You go to the play and you realize that there's different scenes and there's different acts in the play, right? And so if you've never been to one, you might not know exactly how you are supposed to respond throughout the play. I know I didn't the first one I went to. The first one I went to, you sit there and you watch, and all of a sudden the scene comes to an end and the curtain shuts, and I looked at my wife and I said, well, that's an odd place to end the whole deal, but let's go, right? I thought, man, it must be done. She looks at me and says, it's not done. She said, you have a little bit of time. You can go get some popcorn if you want. You can go to the restroom. But here's what she said. You better hustle, because I want you to be back here when that curtain opens back up, because they're back there resetting the stage so that when that curtain opens, they're going to pick the story up for us to see how it ends. Listen close. This is so key. When you read the last words in Malachi, the curtain closes on the stage. But God is not inactive. He's still working behind the scenes. For 400 years, the curtain seems closed, and from the seat, it feels like God is doing nothing. And yet we have the privilege of history to peek behind the curtain, to realize that God was simply back there arranging the stage for the moment the first Christmas would come and the curtain would be drawn. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to give you a real brief, I promise it's brief, history lesson this morning. In 445 BC, that's before Christ, the curtain closes. Some of you would recognize the name Nehemiah. He built the walls around Jerusalem, led the building of the walls around Jerusalem. At this particular time, the Israelites are trying to get their feet under them as a young, struggling nation. There are world powers that are dominating, and the Israelites are a geopolitical football in the hands of those world powers. At this time, the Medo-Persian Empire is in charge. But a mere 100 and some years later, in 331 BC, there was a guy whose name was Philip. Philip from Macedon, he had a son. Listen close. A son who at the age of 24, at the age of 24 years old, conquered the world power, the Medo-Persian Empire. His name happened to be Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was an incredible military mind. He studied even to this day. And he was deeply influenced by another person who lived during this time that maybe you've heard of. His name is Aristotle. Aristotle was a philosopher, and one of the main philosophies that he was all about was unity. Alexander the Great bought into Aristotle's philosophy such that he wanted to unify the world that he was conquering. He wanted it to have one culture, stay with me, one economy, one currency, and one language. And he did a pretty good job of that. He wanted there to be a certain culture, he wanted there to be a certain currency, and he wanted to make sure everybody speaking the same language, namely Koine Greek. It's called the Hellenization of the world. He's Greekifying the world. Here's what's interesting about Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great dominated. He was an incredible military mind, but he died at the age of 33. And his dynasty was split into 4 ways. In 323 BC to 142 BC, you find one of the darkest times in the Jewish history. It's a time where there is atrocities, but in the middle of that, there is a bright light. In the middle of this time, literally you have this Koine Greek that is one language. They took the Old Testament, which was written in Hebrew, and they wrote it in a language so that everybody could read it. So now everybody, even the common man, could read the prophecies that God gave, the promises that God gave. But in the middle of that bright spot, there's atrocities. There was a guy named Antiochus Epiphanes who went into the Jews' temple, into the Holy of Holies. And in the Holy of Holies, slaughtered a pig on the altar. It was in the middle of that time that a group of zealous Jews rose up and with guerrilla warfare fought for their independence. It's a fascinating time in history. And this time was called the time of the Maccabean Revolt. It's where the roots of a holiday that we celebrate today, many Jews do, called Hanukkah, comes from. There is the time period then from 142 BC to 63 BC that represents some Jewish independence. Although there were some dark spots, there was some turbulence, there was some independence that they began to experience until 63 BC. And all of a sudden, you have entering into the scene a man named Pompey with the Roman army. And you find that all of a sudden Palestine is conquered by the Roman army, and they again are under the dominating power to be in the world at that time. In the middle of that time, I don't want you to miss this, there's extreme cruelty the Romans are displaying, but in the middle of that, they're displaying some extremely intelligent engineering. They begin to build roads so that all of a sudden you could get to places that you couldn't get before quicker, and you could all of a sudden reach places that weren't able to be reached in remote spots. And all of a sudden, listen, all of a sudden, when God puts his hand on the drawstring and decides to draw open the curtain, we find his people under the watchful eye of a king named Herod, in a world where the language is unified, where there is a translation of the Old Testament that everyone can read, where there are roads where all of a sudden there is quick and accessible spread of news already in place. And God, when he draws the curtain, has been setting the stage for the coming of the Messiah. Here's the deal. From the seat of human perspective, at the time of the first Christmas, it might have looked like the play had stopped, and many were tempted to leave the play. And when God seems silent, I can begin to confuse his silence for his absence. But I dare not confuse his silence for his absence. Why? Because the story of Christmas tells me this: I can be sure that God is working behind the scenes of my life. Let me ask you a question this morning. Has the curtain ever dropped on your life? Has the curtain ever shut? Has it ever looked like from your seat God was done? Like he was finished? The play was over? Let me ask you this. Have you ever been tempted just to give up and to leave the play? Listen, the story of Christmas tells me this. Don't. You might miss an incredible ending to the story. I don't know what your story's like. I know what mine is like, and I've had many times in my life where I felt like God dropped the curtain. I've had many times in my life where I felt like God stopped working, and I can't see what he's doing. I remember working a job that I loved at a college where I worked in the student life department. I remember the day that my boss called me in. He said, "We're making budget cuts, and your job is cut today." I remember driving home telling my young wife, Jennifer, hey, I don't have a job. I don't know what we're doing. I don't know what the next step is. I remember talking to God, God, what's going on? What are you doing? How are we going to do this? I thought I was doing what you wanted me to do. And God seemed silent. I remember feeling that way when it came time for us to move here to Norton. Been here 8 years, and a little over 8 years, and some of you wouldn't necessarily know this part of my story, but it wasn't that clear to me. 8, 9 years ago, it wasn't that clear to me. I was pastoring a church in Indiana. I was pastoring in the town where my parents lived, and basically my mom was on her deathbed. And I couldn't figure out why in the world God would want me to go 4 hours away when my parents were there, and I had people that I loved, and we had watched this church grow. And I remember we made the decision to come here, and I remember thinking to myself, man, God, I know you're doing something. I just can't see it. It's just not making sense to me. Over and over again in the 8 years that we've been here, God has confirmed to us what he's doing. But 2 weeks ago, I had something happen that just challenged me. About 5 years ago, I became friends with a guy who has become a friend of mine, and I began praying for him almost daily. We would have talks about God, and he would ask questions, and I began praying. For the last 4 or 5 years, I've been praying every day. And 2 weeks ago, I was at the YMCA working out, and he sent me a text. In the text, he said, Dan, he said, I've been watching your sermons online. And he said, I watched the one that you gave this last Sunday. And he said, I just wanted you to know I said yes to Jesus. He said, would you baptize me on December 11th? But then he said something that really humbled me, because it's almost like he knew what I was going to preach today. He said, I'm pretty excited about this, Dan. He said, I've been thinking about everything that has happened for Jesus to finally make it into my life so I could become his follower. All the people he had to put into my life just to save me. Listen to this. It's pretty humbling, Dan. Just to think about the journey even that you had to be on to move from Indiana to intersect my life and help me understand that Jesus has been waiting for me this whole time. It's pretty miraculous, Dan, don't you think? I thought to myself, what an amazing story, the fact that the God who we don't always know what he's doing is active, and he's working behind the scenes. And we keep obeying, we keep following, we keep hanging on to hope, and we want to make sure we're ready in the seat for the proverbial moment that the curtain rises. When he says, now, I want you to see what I've been up to. Now the stage has been reset. Their story doesn't stop there. In verse 18, Zechariah asked the angel, how can I be sure this is going to happen? We're going to have a kid. We're old. He's pretty diplomatic. Guys, we got to take cue from Zechariah here. He says, I'm an old man, and my wife, well, she's well along in years, is what he says, right? Take a note of that, right? Angel says, I'm Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I've been sent to speak to you and to tell you this good news. And now you're going to be silent, not able to speak, till the day this happens, because you did not believe my words. Look at this next part, which will come true at their appointed time. Here's the story of Christmas. God is and always has been and always will be a promise keeper. He says, my word will come true. Gabriel says, you can believe me because these words are coming right from God. The story of Christmas is the story of a God who keeps his word. Over and over again in the Old Testament, God said, I'm going to show up. In fact, in Micah chapter 5, verse 2, it says, the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. Don't miss this. This is 700 years before the first Christmas. In the book of Isaiah, it says the Messiah would be born of a virgin. This is 600 years before the first Christmas. In the book of Genesis, it says the Messiah would come from the line of Abraham. This is 2,000 years before the first Christmas. What's the point? The point is this: I cannot nor dare I confuse his silence with his absence, because I can be absolutely certain he will do what he says all the time. He will always do what he says. When God is silent, it becomes tempting to doubt him. I doubt whether he's going to do what he says and whether he's going to show up like he said he would. Here's the deal. If I'm going to have hope when he appears silent, I'm going to have to lean into what he did say. I'm going to have to know what it is that he did say when he did speak. You can flip that slide, Brandon. There you go. I can be certain of what he will, that he will do what he says all the time. And it means this. Here's what it means. I want you to write this down. It means I need to know what it is that God says. Romans chapter 15, verse 4 says this: such things were written in the scriptures long ago to teach us. And the scriptures give us, there's our word, hope and encouragement. Look here a second. I honestly believe this, that there are a lot of people, maybe a lot of us in this room, freaking out today. We watch the TV, we see what's going on in the news, and we get all freaked out. We go, oh, I can't believe, and what about, and this and that, and the headlines, and I don't know. And I honestly think that the God of Christmas is like, you know something? I put some things in here that if you would just lean in and know what I did say, it would quell your fears. I think there's some of us like, God, why don't you step in? God, you seem so sad. God, what's going on? The society's going to hell in a handbasket. What's going on? And he's like, well, I want you to know what I did say. And if you leaned into what I did say, it might help you in this moment when I seem silent. You see, if you and I are going to hold on to hope when God appears silent, we're going to have to lean into what he did say when he did say it. But then there's a second thing, and that's this. I need not just know what he said, but I need to trust that he's able to do what he says. Sometimes I take matters into my own hands, not because I don't know what he said, but because I don't think he's able to do it. We begin to take matters into our own hands, to do it our way, and to try to give God a hand. What's fascinating about the story of Zechariah and Elizabeth is this. Elizabeth has a relative. Do you know her name? It's Mary. Her relative's name is Mary, and Mary has the very same angel show up, Gabriel. The very same angel shows up to Mary and says, hey, you're going to have a kid. which is unbelievably miraculous news, not because Mary's old, but because Mary is young and she's a virgin. And Mary says to the angel this, she says, "How will this be since I'm a virgin?" The angel answered, "The Holy Spirit will come on you and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. Holy One to be born will be called Son of God, and even Elizabeth, your relative, is going to have a child in her old age. And she who was said to be unable to conceive is in her 6th month, for no word from God will ever fail." New King James Version, it says it this way, "For with God nothing will be impossible." Here's the deal. God says, I keep my word. I'm able to do exactly what it is that I said I would do. But there's another interesting part to the whole story of Zechariah and Elizabeth, found in verse 20, and then we're done. He says, I'm going to keep my word. It's going to come true. And here's the key: at their appointed time. Listen close, guys. This is Christmas. And the God who is working behind the scenes, he listens to my prayers. He always does what he says. He's able to do what he told us he's able to do. And he always shows up at exactly the right time. I can trust the God who seems silent, that his timing is always, 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 always perfect. God's timing is impeccable. Listen, though, I want to tell you something. God's calendar doesn't look like my calendar. Many times I get frustrated because God's calendar doesn't look like mine. His perspective doesn't look like mine. 2 Peter says it this way, "But you must not forget this one thing, dear friends. A day is like 1,000 years to the Lord, and 1,000 years is like a day." The Lord isn't really being slow about his promise, as some people think. No, he's being patient for your sake. He does not want anyone to be destroyed, but he wants everyone to repent. This is the Christmas story. God seemed like he was slow in showing up, and yet Galatians chapter 4 says, when the time was exactly right, God sent his son, born of a woman, subject to the law. God sent him to buy freedom for all of us who were slaves to the law, so that he could adopt us as his very own children. Guys, this is the Christmas story. The Christmas story is about God. The Christmas story is about hope when that God seems silent. The God who seems silent is listening. He's working behind the scenes. He will keep his word, and he always shows up at exactly the right time. So where does that leave us? Here it is in a nutshell. It means this, that I should never confuse God's silence with his absence. Instead, when God is silent, I can trust his presence. That's what Christmas is about. I have to ask myself, what would my life look like if I was absolutely confident God was present? What would I do if I thought God was present right now in this moment? Whatever my answer is to that, begin doing. Because his silence should never be confused with his absence. Let me ask you a question. I'm going to ask the band to come out and get set up. We're going to sing a song at the end. But can I just talk to you guys for a second? Can I ask you this? Have you ever been through a silent night? Have you ever been through a series of silent nights? A week of silent nights? A month of silent nights? A year of silent nights? Can I tell you this? If you haven't, you will. You will. You'll encounter a time in your life when God seems silent, when it feels like your prayers are bouncing off the wall, when you can't tell what he's doing, and you're not sure when he's going to come through on his promise. I have. I have multiple times. I have up here with me this book. It's a book that has inside of it my prayers during a very, very dark night of my soul. If you read what was in here, and I hope you never will, you would find a pastor who's honestly saying, God, why won't you speak up? God, I can't tell what you're doing. God, have you stopped listening to me? See, the dark night of the soul and the times of silence will come. Silent nights come. And the question becomes, how do I hang on to hope in the middle of God's silence? I'll never forget some of those silent nights. As I stood in my parents' living room, watching the most godly man I know, who pastored for next near to 40 years and devoted his entire life to other people. As I watched him die, one of the most excruciating deaths I've ever witnessed. I remember grabbing his hand and us praying in faith, God, please show up. God, please take over. God, please, we need a miracle. God, please, God, please, God, please. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. It felt like the more we prayed, the worse he got. I remember like it was yesterday, the night that he and I were sitting in that living room, as I stood over his bedside and I watched him draw his last breath. Immediately after he drew his last breath, with a tear coming down his face, I looked over his left shoulder and I saw a plaque, and I read it as though my father was speaking it to me at that moment. And the plaque contained one of his favorite verses. And it was as though he was saying, Dan, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Don't lean on your own understanding. You don't see everything that's going on. In all your ways, acknowledge me. Acknowledge God. He's doing something you can't see. He'll keep his promises, and he'll direct your path. For some of you, you're in a silent night. And my question to you is simply this. What would you do today if you were absolutely confident of his presence? How would you begin praying today, this moment, if you were absolutely confident he was listening? My guess is this, is that we wouldn't off the cuff, hey, big guy upstairs, kind of throwing up a prayer. My guess is that we would get real about the rawness and the things that are going on inside of us if we were really confident God was listening. Let me ask you this. What would you begin doing today if you were confident God was working behind the scenes of your life, preparing for the proverbial moment the curtain went up? You see, the reason I ask that is some of you, you know what? Some of you have left the play. You abandoned and you wanted to take matters into your own hands. And it's as though the Spirit of God is saying, no. I'm resetting the stage. Don't give up hope. You're going to miss an incredible ending. It's as though the God of Christmas is saying this, I will always, always keep my word. But it's so long. I will always keep my word. And my timing is impeccable. It's always perfect. So God, I thank you for the story of Christmas. The story of Christmas that tells us how in the world we can hold on to hope when the truth is sometimes you feel silent. I'm so grateful that your silence doesn't mean you're absent. I'm so grateful that right now, at this very moment, you, God of the universe, are listening to me. I'm so grateful that you, this moment, are working behind the scenes of our life, and that you always keep your word, and your timing is impeccable. I am so thankful this morning for the hope of Christmas.